and it's my privilege and honor to introduce you to our final keynote speaker. Evelyn is very well known for basic income community, and one of the central themes of this conference has been experimenting with basic income. And Evelyn is the one who reinvigorated the interest in basic income studies in her previous work. She worked as a community health sciences professor at University of Manitoba, and I think she's so well known for everyone that I asked her if there is something she'd like to share with us, something which is not so known to every one of us. And she told me that she's a beekeeper, and she's also a very modest person, since she told me that she's also preparing honey wine, which is called mead. And she said that it tastes like rocket fuel, but actually she got a prize for that product. So please welcome. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind and interesting introduction. I started working seriously on basic income a little over a decade ago, and I approached basic income through an interest in public health. I'm a health economist. And at that time, Okay. At that time, I went looking for a virtually forgotten Canadian basic income experiment that took place in the 1970s called BIENCOM. And it wasn't a great surprise to me, but it apparently was a great surprise to other people, that I found that giving people a basic income had a huge health impact, a huge effect on their lives. I found that hospitalizations fell for the people in the treatment group by 8.5% relative to the control group. The biggest effects were through mental health. I found that visits to family doctors with mental health complaints fell dramatically. And as I said, that didn't come as any great surprise to me, because I'm a health economist. I work in a busy downtown hospital in Winnipeg. And I think we can see on a fairly regular basis the relationship between poor health and poverty outcomes. So it was no great surprise that doing something about poverty in a real way would have an impact on people's health. But as obvious as that was to me, it wasn't obvious to everybody. And I have been challenged on those results by some people who claim that a 3-year experiment is too short a period of time to expect to see health effects for people. That if basic income affects people's health, we would expect it to take a much longer period of time. And so I was happy to accept Jürgen's challenge a couple of months ago to try to spell out some of the pathways by which we expect basic income to affect health outcomes. I was happy to do it because I thought it needed to be done, but it's not my area of greatest comfort. I feel much more comfortable when I have a bunch of data on the board behind me. And then lucky for me, and unluckily for all the participants in the experiment, this wonderful opportunity for a natural experiment occurred. Because as we spoke about yesterday, Ontario canceled its basic income experiment after a provincial election, despite having promised to keep it during the campaign. So, I'm still going to talk about, is that right? F5? Okay. All right. I'm still going to talk about the health effects of a basic income. I'm still going to talk about theory. But first of all, I want to talk about what happens when a basic income experiment is prematurely stopped. What happens to people's health? And I hope you'll forgive me for repeating some of the things that I said yesterday, but I'm going to repeat them in a slightly different way. Yes, sorry. The new Premier of Ontario is Doug Ford, and he ran on a platform of affordability for the middle class. And that translated into two key promises. First of all, he wanted to reduce the minimum price of beer to $1 a bottle. And secondly, he wanted to eliminate carbon taxes in order to make gasoline cheaper. Nice combination. He during the campaign, promised to continue the experiment, chose not to do that. And shortly after he took power, the Minister of Social Services announced that the basic income pilot was going to be canceled. First of all, it was canceled because the experiment failed. The data showed that it had failed, despite the fact that we had no data. Secondly, it was being canceled because she announced there was a 25% dropout rate, no data. The best social program is a job, and our government's going to ensure that people have one. There was a planned increase of 3% to basic welfare payments in Ontario at the same time. That was cut back to 1.5%. The planned increase to the minimum wage was canceled, and she simultaneously announced that the Auditor General would investigate hundreds of millions of dollars of welfare fraud that apparently nobody was aware of. The cancellation occurred with very little thought about the participants, the 6,000 participants in the experiment. 4,000 people were promised a basic income for 3 years. She said she would announce the details of the cancellation later. There is a vague promise that she's going to do it ethically. There's no idea how long the participants will continue to receive the stipends. The only promise they've received so far is that they'll receive their August payment. The press on the whole has been fairly supportive of the basic income experiment. And Basic Income Canada has reacted to the treatment of the participants, I think, in a whole variety of ways. First of all, they were invited to visit Queen's Park, the provincial parliament, at the request of the opposition. There is talk about a class action lawsuit. There's a lot of lobbying of the federal government and reporting to ethics boards and ombuds people and so on. So there's a lot of activity happening in Ontario right now. But what I really want to talk about is how this affects people's health. And my email box, as you can imagine, has been filling up with all kinds of stuff over the last several weeks. And so I'm going to share some of that email with you with the permission of the people who sent it to me. First of all, I want to say that one thing that's been happening is that people have been struggling. And there are fears of suicide or worse. There are lots of reports in the press and lots of anecdotal reports of people having made decisions to better their lives who are now not able to do that or not able to commit to doing that. The press has picked up and reported a number of stories. And the first email I'd like to share is from Sheila Reguer, who many of you know as the chair of the Basic Income Canada network. And Sheila's reporting on her visit to Queen's Park with about 30 participants. She said, "I had a hard day. Queen's Park went well, but I had to leave the gallery with one of the participants who was breaking down at the callousness of Ford and his gang. It was outrageous. She shared lots with me, and I think she's the one that the Hamilton Group fears is at risk of suicide. The opposition tried to get in questions about basic income and was heckled but from the opposite bench, who wanted to continue to celebrate Buck a beer. The speaker had to reprimand them. Well, it turns out this young woman has FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and the whole thing was too much for her. And I thank her for sharing that and for allowing me to share that here." The behavior has attracted some attention in the newspapers. This is from email I received from one of the participants in Thunder Bay. "I was not surprised so many of the disabled ones were like me, survivors of child sexual abuse with chronic health problems and lifelong mental health and addiction problems. Being in the pilot worked so beautifully for those of us with high ACEs scores," and of course it does. ACEs scores are adverse childhood experience scores. They try to quantify the exposure of a child to physical, sexual, psychological abuse, and it's been validated, and the scores have been validated and linked to chronic health conditions and poor mental health in adulthood. This is another I should continue that. We never had any security, and to get it, some of us for the first time, unleashes our potential in a million ways. Different participant. I wanted you to know, you, that is proponents of basic income, made us feel as if we mattered. The wards of the state who were harmed in CAS, that is in foster care, who were never helped by medicine, who've been ostracized over and over and over. I want to say that there's a special place in my heart for those in the pilot whose trauma was grossly misdiagnosed as psychotic illness by a mental health system. It goes on and on. I mean, I've got all this stuff in my mailbox. This last one I'll share with you. I love the language here. I'm having bandwidth problems due to the trauma that makes some of my other trauma symptoms flare up, sort of. Migraines that went away in the pilot are worse than ever. They started coming back after the election, though. I could see the handwriting on the wall. So you can get a sense that these are real people, and this is having a real effect on people's lives. So I just wanted to get that out there because I'm going to talk about theory. I'm going to talk in a fairly abstract way about theory, about how basic income might affect people's lives. But I think we want to think back not only to the real effect it's having on people, but to the language they're using to express the way basic income, and in this case, the cancellation of basic income, affected their lives. And just to put it in context, I should say that for a single person in Ontario, the basic income in the trial was about double what they would receive from ordinary welfare payments. So it was a significant boost in income, along with the elimination of the conditionality that's so pervasive in the ordinary welfare system. So, how does basic income affect health? What aspects of basic income cause the changes that we think we see? And I want to make sure that it's not just a correlation, that there's actually a pathway that makes some kind of sense that we can talk about, that we can tell a reasonable story, and that the story we tell about how basic income affects health seems to be more or less consistent with the empirical evidence we face. And in particular, I want to talk about three particular pathways. The first is material deprivation, the scarcity argument. The second is income insecurity, and I'll talk a little.
I'm sorry, Evelyn. Is there any way of turning the mic up or speaking more?
Is the problem because she has to move between the screen and is that better?
Yeah. Sorry. Sorry about that. Is that better?
Does that work? Yeah?
Yeah, I can reach it. Thank you. The second is income insecurity. And the third is income inequality. And I want to talk about two different pathways by which income inequality might affect individual health outcomes. The first mediated by effects on individual health through stress, and the second sort of a broader sociological implication of income inequality that works through societal breakdown. So first of all, let me talk about material deprivation. This is a story that's most obvious, I think, to most of us. It's a story consistent with the social determinants of health outcome. About 50% of our health can be determined by the circumstances in which we live, the quality of our housing, the quality of the food we eat, the neighborhood we live in, our access to social resources in that neighborhood. And if you compare that to access to health services is less than 20% of our health. So what a basic income does is it gives people the resources to access the goods and services they need to provide for themselves and for their families. They can buy better food. They can buy access to better housing, better childcare. They can buy health services not provided by the government. Canada has universal health care, but there are many parts of the healthcare system that are not covered, like dental services, like pharmacare. What kinds of evidence do we have to support material deprivation? It's overwhelming. One thing I like to look at is the whole issue of food security. Now, there's nothing magic about food. There's nothing special about food, except that it's an index of extreme deprivation. Families suffering from food deprivation are suffering from extreme deprivation. And Canada, interestingly, has two basic income-like programs in place. One is the child benefit for families with children under 18. I say basic income-like because it's a negative income tax. It's means tested, but it doesn't have the extreme conditions of the welfare system. And the second is a program for seniors, a combination of a universal pension and a guaranteed income supplement. And what happens right now when an individual turns 65, the day an individual turns 65 in Canada, their income virtually doubles if they're a low-income individual. So if you go from the provincial welfare system to the pension system, your income just about doubles. And it's been well demonstrated in Canada, at least, and certainly internationally, that the incidence of food insecurity declines dramatically with the introduction of the child benefit and with the introduction, for those individuals who turn 65. The second one is particularly interesting because people are getting older, but at the same time, they're getting healthier. They're using fewer services, fewer healthcare services, and they're living better lives. The evidence, as I said, is overwhelming. This particular article I'm citing talks about access to pharmaceuticals, but there's a tremendous amount of it. So is this story consistent with the evidence that we observe out there? If this were the only pathway by which basic income affected health, by putting a floor in place, so to speak, by doing something about poverty, then you'd expect health to improve as income improves up to a particular point. But once you reach middle incomes, the improvement should stop, right? There should be no further improvement in health as income increases. But one thing we do know from the literature is that health and income are correlated throughout the entire income spectrum, right? Over the whole income spectrum. So it's part of the story, but it's not the entire story. So I want to go on to the second explanation, and I think these are all valid explanations. They're all part of the story, and I think we're still trying to articulate and to flesh out that story. The second story is the story of income insecurity, and I want to be clear that income insecurity is not the same as low income. Someone with a stable, secure, but low basic income, for example, suffers from material deprivation, perhaps, but not from income insecurity. That is, if it's too low to provide necessary services, they might still be impoverished, but they won't suffer from income insecurity because the basic income itself will provide that security. So income insecurity means that income is potentially unstable. And there are two key ways, I think, for this particular population that income becomes unstable. The first is precarious employment. It's the main, but certainly not the only cause of income insecurity. The second are the conditions attached to welfare payments in the standard system. The conditionality means you can never know with certainty what your income's going to be from month to month to month, which makes it very difficult for a mother, for example, to plan for a family. And again, the evidence of this, and I'm citing Canadian evidence because that's where I am, but the evidence for this is just overwhelming, the empirical evidence. So how does this pathway work? The story we usually tell is not terribly well fleshed out, and I'm an economist, so I'm going to stop well short of the end point here. The argument is that this works through chronic stress. And the evidence of the effects of chronic stress on individual health is just overwhelming. Chronic stress is associated with exacerbations of chronic conditions like diabetes. It's linked to poor birth outcomes. It's clearly linked to mental health outcomes and so on. So how consistent is this with the evidence we observe? Well, the income insecurity that affects our health can actually occur at any point in the income spectrum. Even high-income individuals can suffer from income insecurity. And it's easy to think in this particular environment, for example, for people working on short-term contracts who never quite know whether the next contract and when the next contract will be introduced. Even though their income when they receive it is reasonably high, and their annual income might be quite high, there might be great periods of time when they're not receiving that income. But it's mediated. Income insecurity for high-income individuals is mediated by financial inclusion. It's mediated by individual resilience. which tends to be higher at high incomes because high income people have access to savings, because they have access to financial markets in ways that low income individuals don't. So this is absolutely consistent with what we see in the literature, that the health effects of income are much greater at low incomes than they are at high incomes, but that the correlation occurs throughout the entire spectrum. And I think that this is something that certainly needs to be followed up at some greater cost, because I think one of the things that we don't know very much about is how we get from that chronic stress to the particular health outcomes we're looking at. The third pathway I want to look at is income inequality. And the story that's traditionally been told about income inequality is that inequality affects individual health through upward and downward comparisons, through envy, through chronic stress. The evidence has been presented in a number of places, including most notably Wilkinson and Pickett. But it becomes very difficult to distinguish that story from the income insecurity story statistically, right? How do you distinguish between the pathways empirically? What I think I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about is the second pathway by which income inequality is expected to influence human health. The argument here is that income inequality affects mental and physical health by attacking social solidarity, by breaking down the bonds that hold society together. And because we have less recourse to those common elements that tie us together as a society, our personal and our individual and our family and our community health suffers as a consequence. And there are lots of examples of this, and I'm going to draw my examples from North America because that's what and in fact from the US, because that's where it's been best documented. One of the examples is the change in the religious affiliations of many lower income Americans away from traditional churches that tended to emphasize community towards prosperity gospel churches that tend to emphasize individual achievement and to tell a story of wealth as God's blessing for having lived a good life, I suppose. The second sort of documented increase is the effect that economic conditions have had on the rise of family instability and serial monogamy in particular populations, which tends to reduce the kinds of family bonds that we've seen over time. Again, as we said yesterday, not necessarily a bad thing. Lots of divorces should happen, but there's a regularity here that makes it difficult to talk about the implications for health. The third, and probably more important, is the educational segregation that's taking place. The rise of the importance of private schools and private universities and the gaps that are growing between the opportunities available to ordinary people and the opportunities that are available to an elite. And when I'm talking about an elite, I'm not talking about the 1% or the 0.01%. I'm talking about the ordinary people who conceive of themselves as middle class, the sort of professional middle classes, the top decile of the income distribution. Again, there's a lack of access for those lower on the income hierarchy to the kinds of internships and social networks that come out of the educational framework in many cases, and that facilitate later success. And this creates a whole series of outcomes for those at the bottom of the income distribution. I'd like to, now this one's fairly controversial, but I'm going to put it up anyway. Many of you are probably familiar with some of the work done by two economists, Anne Case and Angus Deaton, who've documented an increase in mortality from what they've called deaths of despair among 50 to 55-year-old white males, rural white males in particular in the US. And they've linked it to economic changes that have occurred. These are the so-called, the people who've been left behind by the economic changes, the people who perhaps didn't graduate from high school, the people who've had less access to economic opportunities that have emerged in recent years than of others. Deaths of despair, they've defined it as deaths from chronic alcoholism, drug poisoning, and self-harm, suicide. And so there's an increase in deaths for that particular range, particularly for men without high school completion. They've documented a similar kind of an increase in most other OECD countries, including Canada, including some of the Nordic countries, although it's much less extreme. Now, there's difficulty with some of their evidence, and I've been playing with that, and it's a very controversial claim. But their argument is essentially that the fact that there is a welfare state in most of these other countries, the fact that there is universal health care, the fact that people can rely on at least some access to a cash-based welfare system rather than food stamps or in-kind contributions, lessens the risk for individuals living in those particular countries. So, what do I want to say about this? I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about basic income, and I'm going to raise what I think is a controversial statement. How does basic income affect human health? I think without any question, basic income, if it's high enough, can eliminate material deprivation. That's sort of a no-brainer. It does a very good job of addressing income insecurity through its insurance effect. That's primarily what basic income does. It provides the kind of regularity that that our participation in the labor market no longer provides, or that our welfare system no longer provides for us. I think basic income has a harder time addressing questions of inequality, largely because inequality is not due to poor people getting poorer. It's due to some rich people getting extremely rich. And I think when we talk about basic income, we're very focused on the bottom end, and we don't spend nearly enough time talking about the tax increases, the tax changes that are going to be necessary to pay for the program. And if we're going to address inequality in a reasonable way, it's those tax changes we need to talk about. Those are the sorts of things that can address inequality. Does basic income enhance social solidarity by giving those at the bottom of the resources they need to participate more fully in society? I raise that because I've heard a few times during the Congress, and I've certainly heard it over the years, the claim that if we talk about a universal basic income as opposed to a negative income tax, that will magically increase social solidarity. I'm going to suggest that in fact is not the case. People aren't really that blind to the fact that some of them are paying a whole lot more in taxes in order to pay for that universal basic income. They know what's happening. They can figure it out. And I think that if we're going to talk about how basic income addresses social solidarity, we need to think a whole lot about what those mechanisms are that either draw society together or drive society apart if we introduce a basic income. And I thank you. I thank you all for coming to the last plenary.
Thank you, Evelyn, for a wonderful keynote. So there is some time for questions and comments from the audience, and we have microphones here. So a technical question. Okay, so we'll start with a technical question in the front.
Aren't there any person like Morten and Andreas in the room who lost all the credit cards? I know who he is.
Okay. So let's move on to more non-technical questions. So, okay, gentleman here in the front.
Thank you. Peter Knight, Sufficiency for Sustainability Network. Just an observation and a question that may need to be dealt with. If everybody gets a UBI, what happens to rentals and housing prices? Residential segregation is reality not only because education inequality too, because if you live in a school district with high-priced houses, usually the public schools are better. I helped acquire a house for my daughter in a good school district, and she was in a much poor one that was very marginal in terms of the classification. California gives marks to schools. So I wonder, how do we deal with this?
A very legitimate question. I've not talked about housing policy because it's not been at the top of my agenda, but you're quite right. Housing policy is obviously central. A very superficial response is that we ought to have school choice. I mean, there should be school choice everywhere. But you're quite right. There are issues involved in housing, particularly in North America, and they're growing issues that exacerbate all of those divisions that I talk about through education.
Okay, more questions, comments? Okay, over there. Please wait for the mic since this is being broadcasted.
Thank you. Okay. I noticed that
Closer.
I can't hear.
who's asked here.
Talk a bit closer
hear
to the
me?
mic.
Closer to the
So we-
mic.
oh,
Please
so we can hear
speak
you.
closer to the mic.
Okay, I'm almost kissing it, but I take your point. Can basic income address income insecurity? And I think you said yes. You said basic income can address income insecurity. And I wonder if you would like to say eliminate rather than address. And the reason why I wonder along that line is that there are people who say they're Marxists or who say they're leftists who would argue that income insecurity is intrinsic to wage labor and capitalism, period. That even individuals, corporations, employers, the bourgeoisie, they are also suffering from precarity and insecurity. And so, but basic income actually resolve the general problem of precarity in bourgeois capitalist society.
I think in case you didn't hear, the question was, can basic income eliminate income insecurity as opposed to reduce it? And I think I'd like to stay with the comment that it will reduce income insecurity. And the reason I say that is because most people, I believe, before or after the introduction of a basic income are still going to be working. And they're still going to be working in a labor market that's probably not going to change dramatically, at least not in positive ways. So I think we're going to be struggling with the changes that are being introduced into the economy through the rise of new work platforms, for example, through the rise of, just-in-time labor. And I think those things are always going to continue to exist, or at least for the foreseeable future. So what a basic income does is it gives people at least one source of income that they can rely on over time. But for most people, that's not going to be their only source of income. They're still going to see declines and increases in income, I believe.
So I see only gentlemen wanted to make questions. Is there any lady in the room who would like to make a question? There's one at the back.
Hi, I just wanted to, I guess, relate my experience of being on income support, which was a relatively unconditional cash transfer to women, and particularly single mothers, which I kind of addresses some of the questions that have come up recently about, well, certainly in the UK, and I guess now in Australia as well, about basic income being a very individualistic sort of solution, that you just give people money and then somehow they kind of run off and escape society. I'm not quite sure how that works, but certainly, in my case, and also it has to be said that I had secure, cheap housing at the time as well. That in fact, the fact that we all had regular money. I lived on a council estate, so all the other mothers were basically in the same state. Some of us had cash work every now and again. We were able to pool together quite a lot of things, like, but particularly childcare. I never paid, my son is 22 now, I never paid for a babysitter ever, okay? And that certainly was the experience in my community. I think we have to, emphasize the importance of community of community connections and community groups in all of this. You know, I think it's also very significant that, like say in the Indian experiment, that people did much better when in villages where Sewa was active. All right, and we can't kind of discount. We really can't discount the kind of mutual aid that can happen with basic income.
Thank you. And I think that's a really good point. And I think that having just a little bit of money that you can count on from week to week makes the creation of those kinds of mutual aid efforts more significant. When I was working on the old MINCOM experiment, a number of participants called me up to tell me what their lives were like and how MINCOM had changed their lives in the 1970s, and they were all telling similar kinds of stories. They were living in an agriculturally dependent small town, so income insecurity was very much a big deal. You know, there's a lot of money when there's a harvest, and there's not a lot of money during bad seasons. And having a basic income just made it possible for people to participate in the most basic ways in society. You know, going out for a beer after work, for example, or you know, going out for coffee and meeting for coffee in the morning, or simply participating in those kinds of things that we sometimes forget still require a little bit of money to participate in. Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Over there.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very informative presentation. Reinhard Huss, living in England but German. Your last question was, does universal basic income increase solidarity? And I think you left it open. I think we have a very interesting natural experiment in terms of tax-financed or insurance-financed health systems. Like in Germany, it's insurance-financed, and the top 10% are exempted from the system, while in, I think, most Scandinavian countries and the UK have a tax-financed system. I don't know whether anybody has done any research about it, but my impression is that the tax-financed system strengthens solidarity, while the sort of insurance system, where especially the richer ones are excluded, undermines solidarity. Everybody is trying to fight to get a better position in the system.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that.
There was a question here in the front.
Thank you. You pointed out the very bad consequences by coming from stopping the announced pilot. I guess an even more dramatic effects would be to stop a basic income that's already in place in a whole nation. So I wonder if we should think about how to guarantee basic income security. I mean, you know, like, what do you have any ideas, like having a lifelong guarantee for that at least?
Unfortunately, I don't have a solution to the fact that we have elections and governments change their mind. I'd like to say I'm a big believer in democracy, but there are times.
Okay, I also want to take this opportunity to make a question, and I very much like your presentation in the way you presented those emails, and that was really it made a deep impact for many of us, I think. So that's why I wanted to ask if there is anything we can do to support those people who are about to lose their benefit in Canada. I know there has been a petition going around, but perhaps you could tell a little bit more about that, or is there any other way to show solidarity for those people who are to be betrayed by their provincial government?
Yes, thank you for that. I did ask people who were associated with some of the ongoing experiments to lend their name to a petition, essentially asking that the provincial government at least live up to the letter of the law in Canada, essentially to live up to the ethical agreements that the experiment was approved under. And that will go forward, I think, next week when I get back. I believe that there's an effort underway to gather support from some of the national organizations. I was going to check with Jürgen sometime shortly after that, but I believe that if not from me, you will hear from the Basic Income Canada Network asking for the support of national organizations. Mostly, there are a number of people, I should say this, there are a number of people in Canada who are still under the belief that this experiment can be revived. I think I'm more concerned about the 4,000 people who were promised money for the next 3 years. So essentially, what we'll be asking for is that those people be treated in a reasonable and fair way. And I should say, just when the experiment was approved in Canada, unlike Finland, we had to have informed consent from the participants. And part of that was that meant that the experiment was approved under the guidelines for the use of human subjects in research. And when this went forward, the ethics committee required that there be a gradual phase out at the end of the experiment, so that even knowing that they would receive money for only 3 years wasn't enough. They couldn't be left with a cliff. The ethics committee demanded that the money be slowly cut off. And now we have no idea, canceled midway, what exactly is going to happen to those participants. So you may very well be asked for support over the next couple of weeks. We've been holding things off at the end of August just because school's starting and it's kind of a chaotic time, and there will be an upsurge, I think, of activity over the next few weeks.
Okay, there is one more question over there.
You use the notion of stress, I think, in a rather narrow way,
Yeah.
because you were talking about stress as occurring from unstable income flow, perhaps from unemployment, precarious work, but it's also a crucial component of overwork that was missing there. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe, I mean, it's very related with the issue of public health or community health, that if basic income as an agenda would also challenge the work ethic, would also challenge because you see also a lot of drug intake among people, high income earners. Like, I know there's a memorable story from the New York Times 2 years ago about this lawyer in the Silicon Valley, a patent lawyer that was a drug addict, and before dying from, he was found surrounded by all the appliances of drug and drugs, and his wife writes the article for the Times, and she tells that the last call he made was to work. Actually, he was fainting and coming in and out of conscience, and he somehow managed to do a phone call to work. This was the last phone call he did. He has 4 kids, by the way. So I think that if the UBI challenge also the work ethic, yeah, it would also result in a very gainful health improvements in the society.
Thank you for that. That's, I think, a really important point. North Americans work many more hours a year than do Europeans, and Europeans work many more hours a year than do some people elsewhere in the world. And I think questioning our relationship with the job market is not a bad thing. I think that's something that we should be doing, and we should be looking at the health implications of a job market that doesn't make it possible to take care of ourselves and our families in reasonable ways. Thank you.
Okay, so with that note, we'll close this session, and please join me in thanking Evelyn.